the current regime is populist, but populism has different forms in different places, right? So the answer, I'm more knowledgeable about the Indian context more than the American, but so there are some similarities and there are some differences. But in the context of India, definitely the rise of this brand of Hindu nationalism, what we have seen since 2014, is definitely a result of the elite backlash. And the elite backlash itself is happening in the context of slowing growth and a largely neoliberal regime that has been prevailing. Now, to the extent that I know, although I'm not an expert, if you want to compare it with the US is also seeing a rise in ethnic nationalism. And to the extent that I have read and seen, the rise of this has something to do with the financial crisis of 2007 and rising inequality, definitely. I'm Sripad Motiram. I'm with the Department of Economics at University of Massachusetts, Boston. India was a British colony for almost 200 years. It was initially under the East India Company, and then it became part of the Crown. It became independent in 1947. So we are looking at, currently a reasonable period of time since independence. And in the initial decades, India, adopted a system of planned development. So, there was a planning commission that was set up before independence itself, and India, made these 5-year plans and used that model. Now, in 1991, in the 90s, early 90s, India embarked on a completely different model. Now, there are some antecedents to this model. Now, when you look at the literature, you will see these changes being referred to as economic reforms or liberalization. Now, what was done as part of these measures is that there was, the state played a bigger role earlier, the government. It had a role in production, in regulation, and the state's role was shrunk. Markets, local markets and global markets started having a bigger role. The private sector, including the private corporate sector, started having a bigger role. Sometimes you will see this whole process as being described using 3 components: liberalization, privatization, globalization. So this process was initiated in the early 90s, and then it has continued. Of course, this was done over a period of time. So we have had now almost 3.5 years of these economic reforms, and they have had profound impacts on the Indian economy and society. And one lens through which these reforms can be understood is through the lens of neoliberalism, which is something that we have seen in many parts of the world. So that's broadly, a broad overview of the kind of policy framework that we have seen in India. One of the consequences that I have tried to understand along with my co-authors has been a rise in inequality in many dimensions. For example, consumption-based inequality, wealth-based inequality. And when we think of inequality, we can think of inequality among people, what is sometimes called as vertical or interpersonal inequality, but also inequality among groups. So broadly, I think it's fair to say that there has been an increase in inequality. There has been more rapid growth. Growth rates have increased, but the growth rate has increased and growth has happened. But the kind of growth we have experienced has not been accompanied by creation of, remunerative employment. So we have something called jobless growth that has happened. So these are the two big consequences, that we have witnessed in the wake of, these neoliberal reforms. And I mean, if you want to take a kind of comparative perspective, um, India has not done as well as, for example, China in terms of its reduction in poverty or the creation of employment, particularly labor intensive employment. India has not been able to do it. We have two kinds of narratives right now. And in some sense, there's no contradiction between these narratives. We can tell a kind of pan-India story and focus on, certain master processes that have unfolded across the country, and, the impact of these processes have been felt in different parts of the country. So that is definitely possible. And, there are three processes that I can mention right now, and this is something that I worked on with co-authors. So, for example, I think we have discussed liberalization, economic reforms. I think these have affected most parts of India, and you could try to construct a pan-India narrative of that. Then you have the rise of ethnic nationalism, Hindu nationalism, which is something that has, now, left its footprint in many parts of the India. I mean, not everywhere, fortunately, but it has reached into, many parts of India. And the kind of empowerment of underprivileged groups like caste groups, this is also something that you can talk about in different parts of India at the pan-India level. So, these are some of the transformations that you can think of which have affected, many parts of India, and you can talk about a kind of a pan-India narrative. But then there are also regional narratives. So as you said, India is a very diverse country. So you have different states in India, and then you have different regions of India. And obviously the processes that have unfolded in these parts, these regions are different. And in fact, one of the areas that has become a very fertile area of research in India is this idea of subnationalism. So particularly in political science, but also in economics, scholars have tried to see the insights that can be gained from looking at different parts of India, different states of India, and trying to see how they can understand the differences in performance. There's an older research idea also, like I think there's a, Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen have tried to look at, regional differences within India. So both these have been done, and I think there's something to learn from both of these. So there are two interesting issues that I've been working on with co-authors about Indian cities. So the first research project that I have with my co-author Vamsi Vakulavarnam at UMass Amherst is to try to understand the nature of urban space in India, and particularly urban inequality, urban poverty. So we have a series of papers where we have shown that inequality has really increased in urban India, since these reforms, since the 90s. And in fact, in many ways, you could say that the urban process is both the site of neoliberalism and also it fed into neoliberalism. So urban inequality has increased in many ways. But there's something very interesting when you observe Indian cities and look at the spatial dimension. So when you look at American cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, they are very starkly segregated. If you think about residential segregation, they are very starkly segregated on race or class lines. Now, if you look at Indian cities, and we have done a survey on Hyderabad and Mumbai, and we have data. So what we find is that in very small spatial units like apartment complexes, what are called enumeration blocks in India, in Indian census, you see high segregation. For example, in a small unit, you have mostly similar caste groups, similar income groups. But when you take slightly larger units, larger spatial units, right, you will see coexistence of multiple castes, multiple classes. Now, this is something unique about Indian cities, and this in a way makes the Indian cities very vibrant. But it also has, it does something more. So what we actually show is that mixed neighborhoods, produce better development outcomes. So the likelihood that a person is poor is lower in a more mixed neighborhood as compared to a less mixed neighborhood. And this is, you could say that, diversity is something that is leading to development. Now, this is an idea that, Amartya Sen had suggested this. He talked about the crime in Calcutta and how crime is very low in Calcutta compared to a place like Singapore. And he says that this is partly because, we don't have too much income-based, class-based segregation in Calcutta. But it has not been really rigorously established. And this is something that we are trying to do in this work. We have a few papers. We are, working on a book manuscript. And there's also a political implication of this, a policy, political implication of this. We talked about neoliberalism. We talked about Hindu majoritarian nationalism. Now, these are forces that try to erode this integration. Neoliberalism, for example, works through the state, works through markets, and then it, excludes, the poor and other marginalized groups. Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, is openly discriminatory against, religious minorities, particularly Muslims. So these are forces that are actually reducing this integration. Now, this is unethical, obviously inequitable, but it also has an impact on development. So what we are arguing is that we need to, reverse these kind of things. We are arguing for what is called sometimes in social science literature, a right to the city. The poor, the marginalized, everybody should have the right to the city. City spaces should be open. Commons should be open. We should reverse these processes. So this is one of the things we are working on. Then I talked about inequality. So one of the things that I have worked on with Vamsi, Arjun and a few co-authors is to look at wealth inequality in India. Now, wealth is something that has not been studied adequately. Although there has been data, the Indian national sample surveys have been collecting data on wealth for a long time, but it has not seen much research. So one of the earliest papers on trying to map wealth inequality, we have shown that wealth, studying wealth and studying the distribution of wealth requires certain special techniques, and we need to have special consideration. So that's something we described, and we showed that wealth inequality increased substantially since the 90s. More recently, we have a very interesting project where we try to understand the nature of elites and top wealth in India by looking at these wealth lists, for example, the Hurun list. And we also did some primary work on Indian cities. So as a part of this project, which is funded by the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, based in Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, we selected 4 cities, Hyderabad, Calcutta, Delhi and Mumbai. And I was actually involved with understanding wealth inequality in Mumbai. So what we did was we looked at these lists. For example, there's something called the Hurun list, which tries to document high net worth individuals, people who have more than 1,000 crores. And then we also tried to look at people who are not so wealthy but still wealthy, 1,000 to 100 crores. And we tried to look at what information is available based on publicly available sources, some interviews, and we tried to construct a narrative of wealth, how it is accumulated, what has changed across Indian history. So if you look at Mumbai, during the pre-colonial period, or pre-colonial and colonial periods, Mumbai was part of the British Empire, but in Bombay Presidency. So we tried to look at what happened during the colonial and pre-colonial periods, what happened before the neoliberal period, and what happened after. How have, like wealth accumulation strategies, how have they changed? So Mumbai is the financial capital of India. So one of the things that happened in the wake of these neoliberal reforms is that finance is one sector that got deregulated. And there was, it opened up a lot of avenues for accumulation in the finance and real estate sectors. So when you look at Mumbai, it's different from other cities because you see a lot of top wealth in the hands of people who are involved in the finance and real estate sectors. And more recently, you see a few people, for example, in the crypto sector. So we tried to study cities and, how how different cities are different. And this is a project that is, unique. Nobody has done this in the Indian context. And in the global south, there are very few projects of this kind that I am aware of. This is a, project that started, a little, it was an earlier project where both my co-author Vamsi and I, we were working on agriculture, and we were looking at what the alternatives for farmers are, these small farmers. And you could think of the traditional setup where what happens is that a farmer borrows from a money lender, and then typically, the farmer also ends up in arrangements where, the farmer sells it to the money lender, the crop, or there is somebody called a commission agent from whom, the farmer could borrow but also sell. There are these arrangements like what are sometimes referred to in the literature as interlinked arrangements. So these are the kind of traditional forms that you see in the Indian agrarian economy, but in the agrarian economies of many developing countries. Now, obviously, these are not doing well. These are not delivering for these farmers. Then there are these newer kind of arrangements that are being proposed under neoliberalism, like, more corporate alternatives like contract farming. So what we tried to do was to think of, a cooperative kind of arrangement. And the inspiration for this comes from the work of Alexander Chayanov, who was a, Russian agronomist who worked a lot on the peasantry. He had this debate with Lenin on the nature of Russian agriculture. And he also worked on the, on the cooperatives. This work is less known than his work on peasantry. So we used that work. And then we were also inspired by the, German, Raiffeisen cooperatives. So our argument was that if you design these, credit and marketing cooperatives properly, wherein these farmers are, they are cultivating their own land, but they are cooperating in obtaining credit and also marketing their produce. And if the state supports them, for example, then this is better for their farmers, for them. And it may work actually better than all these other alternatives. Now, this is an idea we had about, cooperatives in the agricultural sector. But more recently, we have been thinking about extending this idea to, let's say, the urban informal sector. Something similar about, urban informal workers. And in a broader political sense, since we have seen, a top-down kind of state-based solutions, sometimes they have become authoritarian, state-based solutions to hierarchical, existing hierarchical structures. They haven't worked very well, right? So a lot of people have suggested, cooperative solutions in in various domains. For example, even to deal with something like climate change. So this is an agenda that we are trying to really push. So the roots of Hindu nationalism are very deep. They go back to the Indian anti-colonial phase, and the ideologues, the founders of Hindu nationalism, like V.D. Savarkar, they conceptualize their ideas and their thought processes during the colonial period. So the movement itself, the ideas are old. There has been a rise in Hindu nationalism in more recent times. Now, one thing that probably everybody knows is, for example, the destruction of Babri Masjid, the mosque, in 90s, and then recently that temple was consecrated on the same site. Now, the rise of the current phase of Hindu nationalism, right? Now you see a government in power now. This is the third elected government. Now, this rise, this phase, 2014 to what we have now, this is something we have looked at. We have written a couple of pieces, my co-author Vamsi and I, in a more popular domain. This is something like, this is an elite backlash. So what happened here was the following. So there was a government prior to this 2014, what was called the United Progressive Alliance government. There were two different governments, UPA 1, UPA 2. That government, adopted certain welfare programs. For example, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee. It went on a rights-based approach. So they created right to education, right to information. So particularly UPA 1 was more welfare oriented. Now I think growth slowed down for various reasons, including the fact that you had the financial crisis affecting Indian growth. So the rise of the current phase, this current regime, is a kind of elite backlash against that. Now, so in some sense, the current regime is populist, but populism has different forms in different places, right? So the answer, I'm more knowledgeable about the Indian context more than the American. But so there are some similarities and there are some differences. But in the context of India, definitely the rise of this brand of Hindu nationalism, what we have seen since 2014, is definitely a result of the elite backlash. And the elite backlash itself is happening in the context of slowing growth and a largely neoliberal regime that has been prevailing. Now, to the extent that I know, although I'm not an expert, if you want to compare it with the US is also seeing a rise in ethnic nationalism. And to the extent that I have read and seen, the rise of this has something to do with the financial crisis of 2007 and rising inequality, definitely. And in fact, in the US, I would think that both the socialist, democratic socialist, and welfare-oriented policies and program of Bernie Sanders and his supporters, and the white nationalist, kind of Trump, kind of base. The base has some similarities, right? And in some sense, the similarity is partly because of what happened in this country, the rising inequality, the loss in lack of opportunities, the crumbling of the American dream.